Once again, it's good to see everyone tonight. Appreciate everyone's presence, and I hope that something we have to say will be beneficial to us all. We're all aware that throughout the Gospels, during Jesus' earthly ministry, we find him performing many wondrous miracles, healing the sick of dreadful diseases, restoring sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, mobility to the lame, casting out demons that had virtually destroyed lives, and even raising the dead. There's no doubt that Jesus' miracles made a huge difference in the lives of many individuals and families that he touched. But often, after doing such amazing things, we find him asking, or really more accurately, commanding the recipients of these miracles to keep it a secret. For example, in Matthew 8 and verse 4, which will serve as our text tonight, we find Jesus approached by a man who suffered from leprosy. Let's read the account there, beginning with verse 1. The Bible says, "When he had come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. And behold, a leper came and worshipped him, saying, 'Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean.' Then Jesus put out his hand and touched him, saying, 'I am willing, be cleansed.' Immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, 'See that you tell no one, but go your way, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them.'" There's so much to unwrap in that short scene there. There's the faith of the leprous man who boldly stated, "You can make me clean." He had no doubts or reservations. He knew that Jesus could heal him. There's the fact that Jesus put out his hand and touched him. And that may seem like a minor detail to us, but in that day, when leprosy was nothing short of a curse, which was in fact spread by touch, it would have been unheard of. But Jesus showed no fear. He had power over every disease. There's the tender answer that Jesus gave the man. Even though the man had boldly proclaimed that Jesus could heal him, he had also shown humility by not demanding a miracle, but requesting, "If you are willing." And I think Jesus was moved by his humility as well as his faith, and Jesus responded, "I am willing." There's a whole sermon in those three words, "I am willing," a study of how eager God the Father and Christ the Son are to help mankind, how they earnestly desire to save us. And then there's the immediate cure that Jesus' touch and his words brought about, not some slow, gradual healing, as some proclaimed healers might say today, but it was instantaneous. There's the fact that Jesus instructed the man to follow the law of Moses, to show himself to the priest, and to offer the required sacrifice. Jesus was not a transgressor of the law, as he and his disciples were accused of by the Jewish leaders. Instead, as he stated in Matthew 5:17, he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. As I said, there's lots to unwrap in this scene here, but the point that we want to focus on tonight is what Jesus told the man after his leprosy was cleansed. He said, "See that you tell no one." That's just one example of several occasions where Jesus asked for word of his miracles not to be spread. And if you're like me, you've read those scenes all your life, but maybe you've wondered, why would Jesus want to keep his identity and his miracles secret? After all, wasn't the whole point of coming to earth to spread the news of who he was and what he had come to do? And so why the change of heart? Or is there a contradiction here? And so tonight, for a little while, we want to notice some of these accounts and see if we can understand why Jesus would demand such secrecy. Before we look closer at our text, though, I want to take a look at a different scenario where Jesus demanded secrecy, perhaps the first time that he did so. And it's one for which I think we can more easily determine Jesus' motive. It's found in Mark, the first chapter, very soon after Jesus began his ministry. In verse 21, Jesus and his disciples went into the synagogue, and Jesus began to teach. The Bible says that those present were astonished at his teaching because he taught as one having authority, not as the scribes. And then all of a sudden, right there in the synagogue, a man who was possessed with an unclean spirit or demon cries out, saying, "Let us alone. What have we to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Did you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." In Luke's parallel account in Luke 4, he calls this a spirit of an unclean demon. And I don't think we can ever quite understand what demon possession was like in those days, but it must have been terrifying. We read from other accounts how these demons or spirits would cause their victims to cut themselves, to throw themselves into the fire, to run around naked in cemeteries like wild animals. But here we find just such a being acknowledging Jesus as the Holy One of God. And notice the word "the" there, the Holy One, as in the one and only. Obviously, this was a reference, and that I think would have been easily recognized by the Jewish leaders and members of the synagogue, to the Christ, the Messiah. Of God there is equally special, implying that Jesus had come from, or he was appointed by, Jehovah himself. It's quite an introduction. It's quite a confession, if you will, of the true identity of Jesus. After all, James 2:19 tells us that the devils also believe and tremble. But in verse 25, we find that Jesus does not accept the demon's accolades. He responds, "Be quiet and come out of him." The King James Version translates Jesus' rebuke here as, "Hold thy peace." The English Standard says, "Be silent." But scholars tell us that it was probably much sharper even than that. The Greek word that has reference to, or the Greek word here has reference to closing the mouth with a muzzle. It's closer to how someone today might say, "Shut up." And I apologize, parents, if that was a little too PG for the little kids. But I want us to see that Jesus was not about to let this demon say anything more about who he was. He made him be quiet immediately. A few verses later in Mark 1 and verse 34, we read, "Then he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons, and he did not allow the demons to speak because they knew him." And so why not? Why not take a bow, so to speak, and accept the evil spirit's praises? After all, didn't Jesus at one point tell his disciples not to forbid those who were not his followers from performing good works? Didn't he say anyone who isn't against us is for us? But you see, that was precisely the point here. Jesus knew that these evil spirits were against him. Now, granted, the demon's confession might have been made out of fear and sort of a self-serving reverence. He didn't want to be destroyed. But I think we can also easily imagine that it was made out of flattery. Brother Mark Bailey, in his commentary on this verse, says, "Keeping in mind the absolutely evil nature of Satan and his demons, it is probable that this confession is made to tarnish the image of Christ. The very fact it is a demon, the spirit of lies, who identifies Jesus as the Christ, calls into question the truthfulness of the statement. If demons could, by their confession of Christ, cause the world to believe that he is in league with them, then his work would be effectively tarnished." In fact, we see that very danger come true in Mark the 3rd chapter. The scribes accuse Jesus of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub, the ruler of demons. And of course, Jesus refutes that accusation and goes on to equate such blasphemy as an unforgivable sin. That's how serious, how dangerous to his cause Jesus recognized such a false claim to be. And that's why he silenced this demon here in Mark the 1st chapter so abruptly. Well, we might be thinking, okay, I can see why Jesus would silence demons, but why would he try to silence those who had been healed? Why would he stop them from spreading the news about this man who could cure diseases and cast out demons and raise the dead? Well, let's take a closer look at several of those occasions, and I think we'll see that it was really for the same basic reason that he silenced the demon, because it would have hindered his mission. We'll begin by returning to our text there in Matthew the 8th chapter. and the case of the man with leprosy. The account is also given in Mark 1 and Luke 5. And as we read earlier, this man comes to Jesus in humility and faith, asking to be cleansed of his horrible disease. And Jesus is moved, and he willingly touches the man, which results in a full recovery. The man is instructed to go see the priest to offer the proper sacrifices in order to be pronounced clean so that he might be admitted back into the congregation and into society. And as we said, this clearly shows that Jesus saw the importance of being obedient to the law. But it's also possible that Jesus saw the importance of having the priest confirm that this was a genuine and thorough cure. In fact, perhaps that's what Jesus meant by his added phrase there, as a testimony to them. Maybe it was as much for their benefit as it was the man's. However, what we don't learn from Matthew's account, we do read in Mark. Mark 1 verse 45 says of the healed man, however, he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the matter, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter the city, but was outside in deserted places, and they came to him from every direction. Even though Jesus had given this man a direct order, he did not comply. Luke 5 and 15 says, as a result, the report went around concerning him all the more, and great multitudes came together to hear and to be healed by him of their infirmities. Now to us, that might seem like a good result. But I think that Jesus had good reason to want to keep his power and his identity secret, at least at this time. And that's the point. It all had to do with timing, his timing, God's timing, and his plan. Jesus realized that premature attention, maybe unnecessary attention, could at this time hinder his ministry. Yes, he did want his message to spread. In fact, at times he commanded that his ministry be publicized. But in this case, Jesus didn't want to be classified as just a miracle worker. While he had compassion on the sick, he was here to be a spiritual physician. He wasn't here to be a political reformer either. He needed time to teach about what kind of Messiah, what kind of king, what kind of kingdom God had in mind before they seized him and tried to make his movement nothing more than just a way to get out from under Rome's control. And I think the lesson for us is that we too need to trust God's plan and his timing. I loved what someone said in a lesson recently, and I think it was Brother Dwayne, but it might have been one of the teachers here. But they said that when God answers our prayers, sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no, sometimes the answer is yes, but not now. Learning to wait on God teaches us patience. And according to Romans 5 and verse 4, patience produces good character. Well, next we'll turn to a scene that's found in Luke, the 8th chapter. This is where Jesus raises the daughter of Jairus from the dead. It's a touching story, and I think we probably all know it well. Jairus, who was a ruler of the synagogue, fell at Jesus' feet, begging him to come and to heal his 12-year-old daughter who was dying. Jesus agrees, but on the way he's delayed by a woman who had a bleeding condition. And so by the time they reach Jairus' house, the girl has died. And despite the ridicule of those nearby, Jesus says, "Don't weep. She's not dead, she's just sleeping." And then he says, "Little girl, arise." And that's exactly what happens. Imagine the thrill of her parents. But also imagine just as much their shock when, as verse 56 says, he charged them to tell no one what had happened. Why, and honestly, how would you keep such a joyous event a secret? Commentator James Kaufman suggests that that's why Jesus had said before he went into the little girl's room, "She's not dead, she's sleeping." He wanted to maybe throw the Pharisees and other enemies who might have caused a ruckus off of his scent, at least for a moment. After all, later on when Jesus raised Lazarus, who of course had been in the grave for 4 days, there was no question that he was dead. They responded by setting about to kill not only Jesus, but to kill Lazarus again. Jesus didn't want that kind of attention right now because he had a lot to accomplish. The next example we'll notice is that of the blind man, whose story is found in Matthew, the 9th chapter. Beginning in verse 27 there, we read of two blind men who follow Jesus, crying, "Son of David, have mercy on us." Once again, that title, Son of David, means more than we might realize. It was easily recognized as a messianic title of the promised king. And when the men come closer, Jesus asks them if they believe that he can do this, and they reply, "Yes, Lord." And so Jesus touches their eyes, saying, "According to your faith, let it be done for you." And their eyes were opened. Another amazing miracle that certainly must have changed these men's lives forever. But then we read in verses 29 and 30, "And Jesus sternly warned them, saying, 'See that no one knows it.'" According to Brother Mike Criswell, the word that Matthew uses here for warned, Jesus warned them, it's very, very strong. Some scholars say that it even carries the idea of scolding or rebuking with hard breathing and panting, like snorting of horses. Again, Jesus is using some strong language here because he meant business. Yet we read in verse 31, "But when they had departed, they spread the news about him in all that country." These men flatly disobeyed the Lord's command. And we might be tempted to excuse them, saying that surely their excitement was natural. And once again, we might think, well, it all worked out in the end. They actually helped Jesus by telling others about him. But the point is, that was not what he wanted. That's not what he commanded. And the lesson for us in that is that no matter the good intention, no matter what emotions might be behind it, true discipleship teaches us and compels us to obey. Many, many people do what seems good in their own eyes. They follow the way which seems right unto man, as the writer of Proverbs puts it. But if those efforts are contrary to the Lord's command, then they are displeasing to him. Jesus plainly said, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not the things that I say?" Luke 6 and 46. Well, I think we're starting to see a theme here, but let's continue. Next, we'll notice a deaf man whose story is found in Mark, the 7th chapter. Jesus at this time had traveled to the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, to the cities of the Decapolis. And in verse 32, they bring to Jesus a man who was deaf and also had a speech impediment, or some versions say he was mute. He could not speak at all. But they begged Jesus to lay his hand on this man, and Jesus obliged. Mark says that immediately the man's eyes were opened and he plainly spoke. Ears were open, sorry. He was deaf, not blind. His ears were open and he spoke plainly. And then we read in verse 36, "Then he," Jesus, "commanded them that they should tell no one. But the more he commanded them, the more widely they proclaimed it." Again, we might wonder, by this point, why did Jesus insist on keeping the miracle a secret? This was now well into his ministry. He's not in Judea anymore, where his enemies are determined to kill him, where the multitudes are so large and hinder him from moving around. In fact, Jesus is in the same region here where he had healed the demoniac in Mark, the 5th chapter. And that man who he cast a demon out of, he ordered him to proclaim throughout Decapolis what great things the Lord had done for him. And so why the sudden return now to secrecy? Why the flip-flopping, you might say? Once again, I believe it was all about timing. By now, Jesus didn't have much time left. He needed to spend more time in private instruction with his 12 disciples. He didn't need the distraction and the hindrance of excited multitudes who were fighting for his attention. As the time of his crucifixion drew near, he would spend more time on the spiritual part of his mission, the redemptive part of his mission. His primary purpose in coming into the world was to be the Savior, as we said, not just a miraculous healer. And that became more and more his focus as his life on this earth drew to an end. And so perhaps the lesson there for us is one that's been preached a lot here by Brother Nate and others, And that's the lesson of putting what's best over what's good. Putting what's most important over what's important. It's all about priorities. There was nothing wrong with healing the sick and suffering. If so, Jesus would have never done that in the first place. But now he chose that better part, as he described it to Martha. And we can spend a lot of our time on good things, but if we neglect what's most important, it may be all for naught. Well, in all of these examples, and including even the unclean spirit in Mark, the first chapter, as I said, there's a theme that seems to run throughout. Jesus had a plan, and he had a timeline of how he wanted to accomplish his mission. And sometimes that included spreading the word about him, but sometimes it included keeping it silent. And men and women may not have always understood that, and unfortunately they may not have always adhered to his commands. But the point is, when we try to do things our way instead of following God's directions, we run the risk of hindering God's plan and his work. That was true of those who were being healed as much as it was true of the demon. It all boils down to trusting God and obeying his will. Peter put it this way in Acts 11 and verse 17, when he said, "Who are we to hinder or to stand in God's way?" Well, I want to share one more example before we close. It's one thing to tell strangers not to spread the word about miraculous healings. But did you realize that Jesus also told his own disciples to keep quiet about his identity? In Mark, we find that famous scene where Jesus asks his disciples who others and who they themselves think that he is. This is in Mark, the 8th chapter. And we read there, beginning with verse 27, "Now Jesus and his disciples went out to the towns of Caesarea Philippi, and on the road he asked his disciples, saying to them, 'Who do men say that I am?' So they answered, 'John the Baptist, but some say Elijah, and others one of the prophets.' He said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' Peter answered and said to him, 'You are the Christ.'" And then notice verse 30. "Then he strictly warned them that they should tell no one about him." Matthew makes it even plainer. Matthew 16 and verse 20, he writes, "Then he commanded his disciples that they should tell no one that he was Jesus the Christ." Furthermore, after witnessing what must have been one of the most jaw-dropping events in human history, the transfiguration of Jesus, where Jesus' humanity, as it were lifted, and instead his true self was presented in the form of a bright light. His face shined like the sun. Peter, James, and John were allowed to be witnesses to this. They saw with their own eyes Elijah and Moses standing there talking with Jesus. They heard the very voice of God from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." And after witnessing all these things, Mark 9 and verse 9 tells us, "Now as they came down from the mountain, he commanded them that they should tell no one the things they had seen till the Son of Man had risen from the dead." Can you imagine having to keep such a secret? I suppose they even had to keep it secret from the other disciples. And imagine how the other disciples must have felt when they finally heard, "You saw what? You heard what? Why didn't you tell us about this?" Well, because Jesus had told them not to. And once again, we might ask, why? Why discourage his disciples from shouting out the message that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of the living God? Why command them not to tell anyone about the wondrous things that they had seen and heard on the Mount of Transfiguration? Well, simply put, they weren't ready, and the world wasn't ready. The disciples themselves were not ready because they still didn't have a full grasp and understanding of what it all meant. They still had a lot to learn about what it meant to truly follow Jesus. That was certainly proven by their forsaking him at the first sign of trouble in Gethsemane. If they had revealed these secrets, it might have rushed his arrest and his crucifixion before he had time to prepare them. And as we've said, it might have caused a political uprising by those who were looking for an earthly king. In fact, it might have caused Rome to put their foot down and suppress such a movement. As we've said, Jesus knew what was best. And who are the disciples to question his judgment? By the same token, who are we to question God's plan? There's another important lesson for you and me to learn in all this, though, and that is that no longer does Jesus want to be concealed. Just as Jesus told his disciples after he had risen from the dead, his mission was accomplished, and their mission was now to share the good news. In fact, he commanded them to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. No more secrets. I love how one writer put it. He said, after the resurrection, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, could not be hidden. The secret was not and cannot be kept, for Jesus is too great. Jesus' identity broke through, and it became clear that he is indeed the Messiah, the Son of God, the Lord over nature, disease, and even death. And today our mission is still the same, to share that good news with a dying world.